But wiretapping involved no trespass. The police didn't enter into the house of Mr. Olmsted to attach the wires. They attached the wires to his telephone lines after they left the house. So there was no trespass, and therefore the court concluded there was no violation of the Fourth Amendment. Police were free to wiretap without any judicial review because it didn't violate the original purpose of the Fourth Amendment. But Justice Louis Brandeis dissented from that opinion. He said the Fourth Amendment stood for a principle. The objective of this principle was to protect against a certain kind of invasion, to protect privacy. And how you protect privacy, Brandeis said, depends upon the technology of the day. And as time works, changes in that technology, that means that we have to translate old protections into a new context. Now in that case, Brandeis lost. He was in dissent. The wiretap won. But though the wiretap won, the war against illegal alcohol was increasingly a failure. And in 1933, the United States finally fully recognized this failure. They saw the increasing costs from this war, the rise in organized crime, the fall in civil rights, and they saw the vanishing benefits from this war, because it turned out everyone was drinking, prohibition notwithstanding. And what they realized was that the costs of this war were outweighing any possible benefits. So in 1933, prohibition was canceled. Peace was declared in the form of an amendment to the Constitution that repealed the 18th Amendment, thereby allowing states once again to legalize the sale of alcohol. But what was not repealed was the aim to fight this dependence on alcohol. What was repealed was the idea of using war to fight it. Okay, those are three stories. I want to use them in an argument. It's an argument that's focused on this regulation we call copyright. And I want you to notice certain parallels in the current context of this copyright discussion with the stories that I've just told you. Because as with the war and prohibition, so too are we in the middle of a war. Actually, in the United States, we're in the middle of many wars, so let me distinguish and say copyright wars. Wars which my friend, the late Jack Valenti, the former head of the Motion Picture Association of America, referred to as his own, quote, terrorist war, where apparently the terrorists in this war are our children. More than 20,000 people in the United States have been sued by the recording industry as they try to enforce their rights against illegal downloaders. European parallels to the RIAA threaten more such lawsuits. There's an increasing spread of countries considering three-strike statutes that will make it so that if you violate copyright 3 times, your internet connection will be cut off. We have produced a class of criminals, namely our children, as we wage this war of prohibition. And as with, the war which John Philip Sousa was concerned with, this war is also inspired by artists and industry, which has become terrified by changes in technology that will affect a radical change in how their culture gets made. Changes that will destroy one culture, in Sousa's case it was a read-write culture, and produce another, in Sousa's case, a read-only culture. And finally, as with the war of prohibition, there's a fundamental question that we too need to ask. Are the costs of the war we're waging greater than the benefits? Or, alternatively, could we get the benefits of this war without waging these and suffering these costs? Well, to answer that question, we have to think about the relationship between the cost of this current war and its benefits. And to answer it, we have to think first about what the benefits of copyright are. So copyright is a regulation designed as a solution to a particular kind of problem. It's a problem which economists refer to as the problem of externalities. And understanding externality, like most things in life, we turn to the authoritative source, which of course is Wikipedia. And Wikipedia defines externalities as such. An externality is a, quote, impact, either positive or negative, on any party not involved in a given economic transaction. So you can have positive externalities and negative externalities. Negative externalities are ones we're most familiar with. So for example, if someone has a rock concert next to where you live, the noise is a negative externality on you. Somebody starts a hog farm next to where you live, the smell and maybe the flu is a negative externality on you. Somebody builds a coal-fired power plant next to where you live, the smoke and the carbon is a negative externality on you. These are all activities that impose costs on others, others not necessarily involved in the transaction. That's the negative externality. But so too there are positive externalities. So for example, if you run a bee colony, then the bees produce a positive externality to you. If you vaccinate your children, then that vaccination produces a positive externality to others in stopping the spread of deadly diseases. If you compose music, then that composition produces a positive externality to others who can enjoy the music without necessarily paying for its production. These are activities that impose benefits on others, not necessarily involved in the transaction. That makes them positive externalities. That's externalities. Now the economist focuses on externalities because they cause, quote, problems. The problem with positive and negative externalities is that the market produces an inefficient supply. Without regulation, there's too many negative externalities. Without regulation, there's too few positive externalities. So in response to this problem, we try to, as the economist says, internalize the externalities, both the positive and negative externalities. So for example, with concerts, we could have agreements with property owners to limit concerts to certain days or certain times. With hog farms, we could zone the hog farms to make sure they're only in remote areas, not near where people live. With pollution, we might regulate to limit the amount of carbon or pollutants that's exuded from a coal-fired power plant. These are interventions, all to force the producer of negative externalities to internalize the cost. And likewise with positive externalities. Bee farmers enter into agreements with farmers around the bee colonies so that the bee farmer can collect money from the farmers to help pay the cost of supporting the bee colonies. Parents are regulated in many countries around the world to require vaccinations so that everybody bears the same burden and no one bears a cost too great. And with creative work, the state intervenes by creating something like a copyright, to give an exclusive right to the creator to benefit from that creativity for a limited time. These are interventions to allow the producer of positive externalities to internalize the benefit. Now, another case is this intervention absolutely necessary? Sometimes we do fine without any such intervention. So, if your neighbor moves, that's creating a burden on you, but we don't need a fancy government regulation to deal with that. We can get along and deal with it on our own. Or in Germany, they call this art. They paint it on buildings. People like it. The people who paint it on buildings do so without any special compensation from anybody, so everybody in the neighborhood benefits, even though there's been no regulation to collect a fee. In these cases, either because there's incentives enough without intervention, or because the cost of regulations outweighs any benefit, the externality is allowed to exist. The point here is that we don't and shouldn't think of externalities in a religious sense. We should think of it in a very practical sense. We should regulate sensitive to how regulation affects the ecology of creativity that gets regulated.